Hi everyone, this is audap. Let's continue our game of Raging Loop, running on PlayStation 5. And we were just on our second cans.
じゃあこういうのは止めないともっとひどいことになる。それはさすがに忍びないなとか。
ごめん、もうちょっと詳しく。
この辺りには怖い野生動物が出ます。明日にはこの人はズタズタに引き裂かれてしまうかもしれません。このまま見捨てたらとても寝覚めの悪い思いをするかもしれません。それならまあ止めてあげようかしら。
なるほど、リスクと善意を天秤にかけるってわけか。これは想定外。
想定外か。この人だいぶ悪い人なんじゃないかって気がしてきたな。
そう？
だって善意を選択肢に入れる前に殺人鬼とかアリバイとかエロエロとかさ。
エロエロは君が言い出したんでしょうが。
そうだったっけ？で、答えは？
これって単なるバカ話じゃないの？
正解者には素敵なプレゼント。不正解者はブッシュブッシュ殺します。
Seriously? Let's see, you're desperate. You need an alibi. You're a thirsty perv. You feel guilty if you let me die. Well, I think she would feel guilty if she let me die.
ピンポーン、正解です。
Ah, cool.
まあ実際この辺危ないしね。鹿にイノシシに野犬にクマ。
鹿とイノシシは実際見たけど、クマもいるの？
ツキノワだけどね。あんまり多くはないけど、昔襲われた人もいたし、ちょっと外は危ない。
なんてワイルドな。
でも本当にヤバい動物は他にいるけどね。
なんだろう、クマよりヤバい動物？
ヘビ、サル、カラス、クモ。
Huh? Were they venomous or something? I really doubted that. Those really didn't seem worse than bears.
あとオオカミ。
日本にはオオカミはいないでしょ
いるかもよ、こんな田舎には。
She smiled and drank out of the third can.
まあ理由がどうあれ、まんまと美女宅に侵入を果たした春明さんは自分がオオカミになっちゃうのかな。
やめとく。
紳士、もう一本あげちゃう。
I wasn't too sure, but I felt like she'd dodged the subject. Perhaps I wasn't being cautious enough. But then again, I'd been wandering aimlessly for a long time by now. I had enough recklessness in me to enjoy sharing a drink with a cute, if shady girl. 5:12, Monday. The last thing I remembered was our little, when was the last time you pissed yourself while sleeping talk? I had to tell her about the time I got so drunk I wet my pants in the middle of a boarding house. She'd laughed so hard she started frothing at the mouth and passed out. I woke up with a splitting headache. Oh man. Morning already? Light poured in through the frosted window. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. 7 in the morning. I'd gone to sleep somewhere between 2 and 3, which probably wasn't quite enough sleep. At least I didn't wake up to some horror movie scene. The building wasn't in ruins and the girl wasn't actually a skeleton. Though, in a way, this might have been worse. She was spread out on the floor on the other side of the mini-table. Her breathing was mixed with some weird gurgling sounds. I hesitantly looked at her. The saint that saved me from the hell I was in last night had puked in the middle of her sleep. What was I supposed to do here? As a guest, I couldn't really be too harsh on her.
ちえみちゃん。
She wasn't waking up. Well, I just do what little I could. There, that should be good enough. I'd used tons of toilet paper to clean up her mess and flush it down the toilet. It left a stain on the floor, but it was dirty to begin with, so whatever. I'd even wet a towel and cleaned her face. Even then, she showed no sign of waking up. Some of it was on her hair and clothes, but I figured it was best if she took care of that herself.
ちえみちゃん。
朝
First hint of consciousness so far today.
ちょっと出ておくから。
Without waiting for a response, I walked to the entrance. She'd have to take a shower and change and all that, so I'd kill some time outside. I stepped into my still damp shoes with my bare feet. My socks were in the washing machine with a towel she gave me to wipe my legs, and reached for the doorknob. I opened the door and was greeted by a gust of wind. The raindrops gathered on the leaves of the tree next to the building flew right in my face, making me grimace. The rain from last night was already over. The sky was pretty clear, but despite that, I noticed the visibility of my surroundings was poor. The building was surrounded by leaves. The old structure was basically buried in a forest of trees about as tall as itself. There were branches poking into the exposed hallway. It almost felt like they'd reached out and grabbed me if I wasn't careful. It kind of felt like I was in an overgrown ruin. I turned around and saw the room and Chammy just as I left them. Yep, it was all real. I closed the door. There were other rooms in this building, which made me wonder if they were occupied. Hell, I wondered the same thing about the area in general. I pushed the branches aside to see if there were other buildings nearby. Suddenly, something entered my vision. It didn't feel right. Something that shouldn't have been there. The leaves I moved revealed a woman clad in curious clothing. The moment I recognized her as such, she opened her closed eyes. Did our eyes meet? Another strong wind. I shielded my face from the spray of raindrops. When I looked outside again, the woman was nowhere in sight. Was that an illusion? If not, then what? What kind of place was this? It could have been a real Hicksville, a marginal village, a bunch of actual ruins, or an illegal settlement. I had some theories, but I set them aside for now. It seemed like a place worth exploring regardless. I went down the stairs and found no sign of the woman, or anyone else for that matter. A short distance away from the building, I turned around, and sure enough, it was pretty much covered in trees. I went to the place where I saw the woman. There were footprints in the grass here. Maybe I'd find her if I followed them. They led me to an open area. It was unused, but it looked like someone was trying to do something with it. Was it supposed to be a construction site? Even if it was clearly abandoned. There were large rocks and lots of sediment near a prefab. From what I could tell, there had been a giant landslide which forced them to stop construction. The fact that plant growth was still minimal meant that it happened fairly recently. The footprints seemed to be going down the hill next to the site. Following them, I finally saw something that could be called civilization. There was a set of paddy fields with houses nearby. So this actually was a settlement. What a relief. I decided to keep following the footprints and approach the settlement. I came across another unpaved path that was clearly used by people and cars. It was lined with weeds and bushes reaching up to my waist. It was home to caterpillars and grasshoppers, among other things. Spiders were no exception. There was no shortage of insects there, so it was a good place for a net. I wasn't particularly scared of spiders, but I didn't like them either. At least they were just harmless orb weavers. Regardless, I avoided these bushes just in case and followed the path like the good city boy I was. There was a large boulder surrounded by grass. It was strangely tall, making it look like it was put there by people. On its dewy surface, there was a gray tree frog, ready to go after the many insects scattered about. I walked a bit further and came across a house with a small field nearby. The field's location made it safe to assume it belonged to the inhabitants. If there were inhabitants anyway. I couldn't see anyone, and just like always, there was grass everywhere. There was another boulder standing next to the house. This one was obviously placed there by a human hand. What was the point? Was it a monument or something? The footprints continued into the field. The wet mud on the field was full of small, young, but healthy-looking rice plants. If you ignored the standing boulders in the area, the place looked like a normal farming village. I was both relieved and worried at the same time. From what I saw, there weren't any other buildings besides the ones in this settlement. Everything beyond was just mountains, meaning that this place was completely isolated. And I was a complete outsider. There was no way things would go well if I ran into a random local. I belatedly crouched to hide myself a bit. It was probably best for me to go back. Chamie might have been looking for me. Suddenly, I heard a sound. I looked for its source and found a speaker on a wooden utility pole in the middle of a small plaza. A morning broadcast? I'd never heard this tune before. It was cheerful at first, but had some parts that seemed really dark. I found it unsettling. Perplexed, I stopped walking, and what happened next made me hide myself. There was a person in the area densely surrounded by houses, but they weren't normal. What was with that appearance? What was that on her face? Though I was a fair distance away, I could see an old woman with some sort of cloth over her face shakily walk out from between the buildings. Oddly enough, there were boulders even there. But even weirder was the fact that she walked up to one of them, lightly joined her hands, and bowed her head before it, her face still hidden. Then all was silence. It actually looked like she was revering it. To me, it looked like she was praying to it. This was bad, really bad. I'd wandered into a settlement with a unique culture, to put it lightly. Forget causing trouble. An outsider like me could get killed here. I just turned around and ran for it. I dashed up the hill, past the house, through the construction site, until I arrived back at the apartment building. Jamie looked like a relatively reasonable person. Maybe she could tell me what was up. It just hit me that the way she described this place was somewhat weird. She basically said it wasn't normal.
あるいはちえみちゃんが恐るべき殺人鬼で僕を酔っ払わせてぶっ殺す。
はあ、ヤマンバいいね。ブッシュブッシュ殺しちゃう。
No way. What if she was actually the bait they used to lure outsiders here? Eventually, the broadcast stopped. Jamie still hadn't come out of her room. She didn't respond even when I knocked or called out to her. I didn't have to worry about this, right? That just made my inexplicable unease grow worse. What if this was a trap? Was I in a dangerous situation? I had to talk to her. If she was a normal person, anyway. Maybe my best option was to run away right now. I wouldn't know where to run. I couldn't remember the path we'd taken here, though I was pretty sure we went uphill, so maybe I had to go down? If I avoided the settlement and went back to the mountain stream, I could escape by following the wild roads. That was my best option, even with the difficulties considered. Thankfully, I'd taken my bag with me. I took out a 5,000 yen note and put it in Jamie's newspaper box. It was payment for last night's beer. The moment I turned around to take my leave, the door to the next room to the staircase opened slightly with a creak. I saw an eye glaring at me through the gap. Her high-pitched scream pierced my eardrums. I screamed too, scared shitless, and ran for it. Suddenly, I stepped onto the wet hallway floor at a bad angle. I fell. Thud.
はるちゃん、どうした？
ああ、誰このおっちゃん。
あなた誰ですか？っていうか、大丈夫ですか？
The reasonable-sounding voice prompted me to shake off the pain and raise my head. There were two boys in formal-looking school uniforms.
大丈夫ですか？
He repeated the question.
ああ、ちょっと驚いただけで。
おっちゃん、ちえねえの友達？
Chiene?
ああ、ちえみちゃんのことか。
大学のお知り合いですか？お知り合いが来るなんて聞いてなかった。
いや、いろいろあって助けられたんだ。怪しいものじゃないんだ。怪しく見えるだろうけど。
怪しいな、おっちゃん。
どうすればいいのかな。とりあえず、名前は久石春明と言います。
僕は織部安永です。こっちは鴨志田近持。
モッチーだ。
Good to know. If I called him that, maybe he'd stop calling me old man. I was only 24.
それでこっちが。はるちゃん何してんの？
だって知らない人が。
Apparently, this Hara-chan was the person who'd looked at me through the gap in the door and screamed.
とりあえず大丈夫そうだから出ておいでよ。
A moment later, she slammed the door shut, and after a few more moments of hesitation, opened it again. Oh, she looked like a student too, except her fashion sense was exceptionally flashy.
あなた誰ですか？
久石春明と言って、この近くでバイクで事故って、芹沢千恵美さんに助けられたんだ。
え？それってもしかして昨日の夜知恵姉の部屋に。
あ、うん。止めてもらった。
She cut my words short with her ear-piercing shriek.
通りでさ、
の女性の家に不潔。
ああ、うん。それはその通りで、僕もちょっと躊躇はしたんだけど、ちえみちゃんが親切で。
ちえみちゃん、あれなれしい。それじゃあもしかしてちえ姉が出てこないのって、ドアに5000円挟んであるじゃん。
夫妻さん、まさか。
違う。単に昨日お酒をおごられたからそのお返しで。
ちえ姉の体が5000円ってそんな安いわけないでしょ。ただれてるな。
The hell were these kids saying?
ああ、君助けてくれないか。
初対面で女性の部屋でお酒を飲んだんですか？そして知恵姉は出てこない。
Crap, I had no allies here.
一体何事？
And so the subject of the conversation joined in.
おお、ちえみちゃん、君からも事情を説明。
Something was off about her aura. What happened to the lively girl she'd been yesterday?
知恵姉、まさか。
恥ずかしいとこを見られちゃった。
おお。
いや、ちょっと待って、ちょっと。
もうお嫁行けない。
Man, what a mess. Though Jamie's face was all pale, she was actually grinning. She obviously had a bad hangover, but that didn't stop her from messing around. After calming everyone down, Jamie explained what actually happened. How we met in the middle of the night. How she let me stay out of goodwill. How we drank ourselves silly and how nothing happened between us.
いやー、久々に深酒しちゃって思いっきり入っちゃったよ。春明さん、お見苦しいとこ申し訳ない。
ああ、いや、それはいいんだけど。
That Hana-chan girl still looked at me funny.
非常識。
ああ、うん。申し訳ない。昨日は本当に疲労困憊でね。つい好意に甘えてしまったんだ。
まあちえ姉だしな。雑把だよな。
事情も事情だし、年寄りたちも納得するかな。ちなみに会ったのってどこです？
それはね。
下の方の河原だよ。
My words made everyone change their expressions.
それはちょっと。
大騒ぎだ。2日連続で2人もだなんて。
もしかしてまずいこと言った？
はあ、まあいずれバレることよ。さっきあれだけ大騒ぎしちゃったからYasumizu中に知れちゃったろうし。
君、2日連続で2人もって何のこと？
触らないで、汚い。
I wasn't trying to touch her, and I wasn't filthy. Sure, I hadn't had a bath in over a day, but still.
君、何が騒ぎになるの？
タエバあたりが拒否ってなる。
Well, that sure sounded bad.
詳しい話を聞かせてくれない？
ちょっと説明は難しいんですけど、まあここは田舎なんで町といろいろ違うってことですよ。
The guy here was Odape-kun. Ignore Jamie, and he was the easiest person to talk to.
どうすればいいかな？
まあちえみが何とかしましょう。学生諸君はとりあえずご飯行かないと。
この混乱には乗るっきゃない。
乗るっきゃなくないもっち。とりあえず行っちゃいな。私らちょっと遅れていくから。
まあちょっと時間ずらした方がいいよね。揉めそうだし。
さすがヤス君、察しがいいぞ。ごめんけど2人のお守りよろしくね。
うん。
もうちえ姉、子供扱いはやめてよ。そうだ、うんこしてやるぞ。
ほらほら行くぞ、モッチーにハルちゃん。
And so the students walked off towards the stairs. It was kind of easy to tell what sort of relationship they had. Anyway.
彼らがこの建物の他の住人？
そういうこと。学生寮だからね、ここ。
A student dorm? In this Hicksville? Still, my senses had betrayed me. There actually were other people here.
ちなみに春明さん、他の人と出会ってトラブったりしてないよね？
あ、うん。一応それ警戒してたから。
ならよかった。よし、ちょっとしたら食堂に行きましょう。
あ、朝食？
の、 朝食は今から食べてください。食堂へは一応面通しをしに行くの。
え、誰と？
よそ者が皿長からやってきたってことに文句を言いそうな人たち。
Oh. So like that, Thai bar person, huh?
お世話になります。
いいってことです。その代わり、朝のことは秘密で。
そりゃあもちろん。ところで、皿長って何？あの河原？
そう。皿長の瀬っていう川だけど、あの辺まとめて皿長って呼ぶの。ちょっと曰くのある場所でね。
曰く？
うん。あの川は汚れていて、死人が帰ってくる、みたいな伝説がね。
Oh. So that's why they reacted like that.
他にもその手のルールというか、しきたりみたいなのが？
たくさんあります。なので基本、ちえみちゃんにお任せを。
Gladly, on all fronts.
ちなみに、身の危険とかは？
ないない。でも、いろいろ不愉快な思いをする前に、早く出ていけた方がいいかも。
そのための根回しに行く、と。
そうそう。
The settlement I'd strayed to was a weird place, but at least the guide was reliable. And she wanted me to leave ASAP, huh? That was depressing. Jamie gave me some cup ramen for breakfast. She boiled the water in a small electric kettle. The girl herself was too hungover to eat anything. I did take the opportunity to pay her back for last night's drinks in person, though. Then we made our way to the dining hall.
この岩って何なの？
一応お守りみたいなもの？昔からあるよ。
よそでは見たことないよ。
ああ、言われたらそうかも。
She led me along a narrower path than I'd followed earlier. It didn't seem like any cars used this one. It was very farmy, I guess. This area was also littered with these boulders. Some were cracked, broken, or half buried in the fields. They were clearly religious symbols, but it didn't look like they were that important these days. Or were they? Now that I knew I was safe, I once again became curious about this place.
あ、人だ。
He was working on the field.
たくみ兄ちゃんだ。おはよ
Jamie waved her hand. The man responded, but then froze mid-wave.
う。じゃあ行きましょう。
いいの？多分あの人、僕の存在に驚いたんじゃ。
大丈夫。どうせ後で食堂に来るから、説明はその時にするってことで。
Well, if she said so. As an outsider, I had no choice but to rely on her. This was part of the village I saw this morning, where the buildings were more densely packed. I didn't notice it back then, but it was actually kind of weird. Basically, it felt desolate. The wooden bungalows, in particular, were more or less overgrown, buried in tall grass and other greenery. If this was all I saw of the village and someone told me it was abandoned, I'd have easily believed them. However, two of the buildings stood out. There was a hall right behind the hill. It wasn't that big, but it looked grand enough and well maintained. The other building was obviously the dining hall. It looked a bit dirty, but I could tell there were people inside. From what I could tell, it was the most lively place in this poor excuse for a community. Suddenly, the three students walked out, chatting about something.
あ、知恵ねと夫妻さん。
再度おはよう。ちょっと遅くない？
モッチーがバカなことばっか言って遅くなっちゃったんだもん。そうだ、僕が悪だ。味噌汁をよこせ。
まあ早足なら間に合うでしょう。みんなしっかり勉強しといで。
Half dashing, the three ran up the path we came from.
みんな高校生なんだ。
そう。山をぐーっと登ったところに分校があるんだ。私も3年前まで通ってたな。
やたら不便だね。
それでもみんなあの寮に住める分優遇されてるんだけど。
Jamie was entirely straight-faced. There wasn't even a hint of a smile.
さあ、気合を入れて入りましょう。
そうしましょう。
気合入んない。
We laughed a little and passed the curtain.
いらっしゃい。あら。
The inside was as aged as the outside, but it looked well maintained.
ちえみちゃん、お客さん？
The hostess-looking lady asked. Though somewhat aged and fatigued, she was definitely beautiful. There were two others beside her. One was a lady in her 70s or 80s. She was probably the one I saw this morning. The silhouette matched. The other was a man who seemed a bit younger than her, probably in his late 60s. Though they were just sitting there, there was a menacing aura about them.
紹介するね。房石春明さん。昨日の晩、皿長で迷ってたのを千恵美が保護しました。
The reactions were powerful. The lady gasped, and the two elders rose to their feet with alarm. The tension that was already there the moment I walked in reached its peak.
気にするのもわかるけど、これは単なる偶然です。あの子と違って、この人は素性が明らかだし、バイクで旧道に突っ込んで事故ったって非常に気の毒な事情もある。そんなわけで、我々としてはこの人がちゃんと帰れるように手伝ってあげるのがいいと千恵美は思います。どうですか、皆様方。
After saying all that, Jamie fell silent. The ball was in their court now.
まあ、それは大変。
The lady voiced a harmless opinion, careful not to upset the old people. It was pretty clear who was in charge. They were the elders in more ways than one.
ちいちゃんはなんで夜に皿長なんぞ言っとったかね。
虫の知らせかな。前の日にあんなことあったし、眠れなかったから。
そいじゃやっぱり読み人じゃないんかね。
やめ、タエバ。
From the conversation, it was pretty clear that something had happened before I arrived here. It was probably similar to what happened with me. She'd mentioned some little girl. Perhaps there was a child who'd wandered in here like I did. According to Jamie, the Sadanaga Rapids were a place of significance around here. It was a place from which dead people came to life or whatever. Ah, so this Tai must be the E lady that boy mentioned, and the Yomibitu must be a term for the dead who came from there. Apparently, the primary goal here was convincing these elders to approve helping me.
おい、どっから来た？
The old man's voice put my derailed mind back on track.
はい、東京です。
いくつじゃ？
年は24です。
地位より上じゃが。
He chuckled. I immediately realized he was taking a jab at me for hiding behind a younger girl.
申し遅れました。房石春明です。芹沢さんにも紹介された通り、バイクで事故って迷い込みました。どうやら僕は、ここでは異分子のようで、変なことを言ったりしたりして、皆さんに迷惑かけたくないなと。それで、芹沢さんに紹介をお願いしたんですが、僕から改めてお願いします。すぐ出て行きますから、それまでは僕の存在を多めに見ていただけないかと。それと、僕を助けてくれた芹沢さんを責めないであげてください。
春明さん。
おそらく芹沢さんは、ここの常識を外れたところで僕を助けてくれたんだと思うんです。学生たちもみんな驚いてた。
まあ。
これでも大人です。自分の責任は自分で取りますし、皆さんにかけた迷惑は可能な限り償います。ですので、どうかお願いします。
I bowed my head.
ちゃんとしとる、タエバ。
あたしゃあすかんわね。そんなに髪茶色に染めてから。
Shit. I forgot I didn't look very presentable to more traditionalist people.
よそは皆こうよ。はよう返せばええ。
ほいじゃ好きにしなさいね。
I guess I got their half-hearted approval.
春明。春か。うちの孫も春じゃ。紛らわしい。
もしかして
そう、春ちゃんのおじいさんの牧島勘三さんよ。
どうも。
I didn't know what else to say. Hana-chan and I weren't on the best terms so far. Anyway, it seemed like we were past the difficult part.
皿長に突っ込んだか。
いえ、コンビニで道を聞いた後、脇道に入って未舗装になったところで滑り落ちて横転しました。
で、皿長登ったか。なぜ途中で引き返さねえ。
He wasn't impressed by my choice of actions. It just hit me that I had no idea how much time had passed between the crash and my meeting with Chaimi.
わしと匠で見てきちゃる。
匠は他を見よるわよ。
タエバ、追い出す思うて手伝わせ。
カンちゃんはいっつもそうね。
ばあちゃん、おやっさん、 どうした？
We were joined by a new inhabitant.
ちえみ、こいつは？
あ、匠兄ちゃん。
Oh, so he was the one we saw on the field. Wow, he sure looked big from up close. All that field work was good for his muscles, clearly, and from what I could tell, he was in his 30s. As Chaimi introduced me and told him of my situation, I found out his name, Takumi Muro.
ああ、そいつは災難だったな。ああ、おやっさん。
わしとお前で拾う。
だな。ばあちゃん、こいつ助けっからちょっと待っててな。もう農薬は巻き終わってるから、昼から草刈るわ。
匠は優しいね。
こんなもんなんでもないって。すぐ何もなかったようにできるからよ。
そうね。
Nothing, eh?
お兄ちゃんや。
え、僕ですか？はい。
ここは安水言うてね。あんまりええ場所じゃないんよ。
Hmm? It was the place that wasn't good? Not my presence here?
あたしらもよそのもんが苦手だし、よそのもんも触れんがええ。じゃから、はよ出てお行き。
はい、そのつもりです。
話はついた感じか？
うん、ありがとう、匠兄ちゃん。
I was beginning to understand how things worked here. Although Kanzo Makinisha's voice was the most powerful here, it was also important to get Taisan's approval. Kanzo-san was probably in charge of tackling the settlement's practical problems, while Taisan provided spiritual and moral direction. And when it came time to be civilized, Takumi-san came and convinced Taisan, acting as an intermediary. It looked like Takumi-san himself understood such subtleties, and Chaimi seemed to rely on this side of him.
はい、ここらで一つどうぞ。
The lady brought some tea to the old folk. Perfect timing.
おお、香織さん。俺には飯頼むぜ。
So that was her name.
朝早くからお疲れ様でした。大盛りにしますからね。
なーに、安水とばあちゃんと香織さんのためならへでもねえよ。
まあ。
These two sure seemed to get along. They looked about the same age, too.
さあ、お客さんもご飯にされます？
あ、いえ、いただいてきたので。
それじゃあお茶をどうぞ。おにぎりでもお出ししましょう。
ああ、それは。
ごめんなさい、ちょっと急ぎで電話借りていいかな、香織さん。
Oh?
それはいいけど、お茶くらいは。
うん、ありがとう。でもほんと緊急だから。行こう、春明さん。
うん。
It didn't look like I could say no. We went up the nearby stairs to what seemed like a living space. At the end of the creaky hallway, there was a black rotary phone, a rarity in this day and age.
これがここ、安水唯一の電話だから。
Seriously?
ちなみに、携帯電話はどのキャリアも通じませんので。
そうなのか。でもどこに電話しろって？
ロードサービスとか保険とか、あと必要なら家族にも連絡。
Oh, that made sense. Hell, I should have been the one to say that.
さっきも言ったけど、できるだけここを早く出られた方がいいから、使えるものは何でも使いましょう。
よそ者が歓迎されない場所だから？
そういうことです。
それ以上の詮索は無用と。
春明さんはとっても察しがいい。それはいいことだと思う。ただ好奇心もとっても強く見える。
バレたか。
バレますとも。でも正直あんまりいろいろ首突っ込まない方がいいかも。
どうせすぐに別れるんだし。
その通り。
なんだか寂しいな。
お、ちえみちゃんのメアド御書も
くれるならぜひ。
やったー、これで男友達53人目。
テンションガタ落ちですわ。
We still went on to exchange our info. I could only hope that being number 53 wasn't as big of a problem as it sounded. We still went... okay.
それはともかく、個人的興味で言えば、何が問題になってて、どんな背景があるのか知りたいのだけど。
おすすめしないな。
なぜかな。
私が不愉快になるから。
あんまり故郷が好きじゃない？
うん。正直嫌い。
ここの人とは仲良さそうに見えるけど。
ああ、それは見えるだけですね。私相当の問題児だったんで、ご年配方とは結構気まずいよ。それにパッと見はわからないいろんなしがらみもあるし、まあ住人自体はそんなに嫌いじゃないけどね。
With that, I decided to stop prying about this place any further. I backed away before she came to hate me.
あ、でも一つだけ聞いていい？
いい度胸。何かな？
室匠さんのこと好きだったりする？
え？私が？
うん。
さすがにそれはないな。匠兄ちゃんかっこいいけど、ごつすぎるし10以上年違うし対象外です。それに匠兄ちゃんは昔から香織さん一筋だし。
やっぱそうなんだ。結婚してるわけじゃないの？
うん。香織さん未亡人だから。
Well, that seemed complicated. That aside, Jamie had been acting a bit strange. Why had she dragged me away from the tea? It seemed so awkward, too. Assuming she hadn't been jealous of Kaori-san and simply didn't want her to charm me, it would mean she just hadn't wanted me to drink the tea. Why? Also, why'd she feed me cup ramen if I could just have gotten food at the dining hall? Looking too deep into things was part of my nature, though things were never as bad as I assumed. I went on to call my insurance company where I found out something. Apparently, this village was hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest service station, meaning I was ineligible for the normal service and had to pay extra. And the extra was no small amount, too. It actually went over 100,000 yen. Also, I could have avoided this if I'd taken a more expensive plan. This was all my own fault for not taking the bike salesman's advice. Shit. I said I would consider it and hung up. Then I went back to the dining hall.
あれ、おじいさんたちは。
The customers had changed completely. Tai-san, Kanzo-san, and Takumi-san were gone now. They were replaced by a caricature of a juvenile delinquent. He shouted at me. It seemed like he was trying too hard. He then slammed his bowl and chopsticks on the table and stood up to intimidate me.
久石春明です。
はあ？だよ、舐めてんのか。
まあ、義継。初対面の方になんて口の利き方を。
うるせえババア。おいチェネ、そいつ誰だよ。
バイクで事故った旅行者の春明さん。
Boy, was that introduction half-assed.
改めてこちら織部香織さんと次男の義継くん、安永くんが長男ね。
安永くんって朝の彼？
そう、よく見たら似てるでしょ。
The Odabes, what an unpredictable family.
兄貴のこと言ってんじゃねえよ。うぜんだよ、ブスチェ。
そう言われてもな、モテちゃうからな、ちえ姉ちゃんは。
And from what I'd seen, that confidence was well justified.
とっとと町へ戻っちまえ、バカ女。バカバカバカ。
どうしよう、春明さん。バカは否定できないかも。
なんと、ちえみちゃんはバカだったのか。よーし、バカバカ。
ひどい。
言ってやろうぜ、義継くん。バカバカ。
なんなんだよ、てめえ。チェネバカにしてんじゃねえよ。
You're pretty conflicted, aren't you?
ごめん、ちえみちゃん。本心じゃないんだ。
おお、見事な連続手のひら返し。このちえみをあっけに取られさせるとはなかなかやるな、春明さん。
ちえみちゃんには負けないぜ。
付き合ってんのか、てめえら。
Boy, did I wish.
いい加減になさい、義継。とうに遅刻でしょ。着替えて学校。
うるせえ。行かねえよ。
Mumbling something, the kid walked out of the dining hall, leaving his half-full bowl behind.
ごめんなさいね。お恥ずかしいところを。
根は素直ないい子なんですけどね。
Yeah, I could actually see that, somewhat.
あ、ところで、牧島さんと室さんは？
あ、もうバイク拾いに出ましたよ。
まずい。追いかけないと。
うん、場所は分かってるみたいだったし、大丈夫じゃない？
いや、一応ニュートラルにすれば押せるけどさ、操作わかるのかな。あとさすがに手伝うべきでしょ。 作業が非効率になっちゃまずいし。
その程度なら手出しはやめときましょう。
なんで？
取りも直さず春明さんがよそ者だからです。長時間一緒に歩くのはちょっとおすすめできない。
問題になりそうな人たちには思えなかったけど。
そりゃあ2人とも大人だから。でも基本的にこのちえみほどオープンな人はここにはそうそういないからね。春明さんは平気かもだけど、一緒にいると向こうがストレス溜めるかもしれない。ただでさえ今普通じゃないから。
まあそうね。任せろと言われたら手出しをしない方がいいでしょうね。
そうなんですか。
ええ。安水には安水のやり方がある。男の人たちはそれにこだわるから。
I could somewhat understand that. A visitor should behave like one. Doing anything more would be uncalled for. It was an old-fashioned way of thinking, but this was an old-fashioned kind of place for sure.
じゃあどこで待とうか。
うちに戻って待ちましょう。
Expected as much, but it still made me curious. Normally you'd expect we'd sit around and drink some tea right here, so why didn't we? As we waited, Chaimi, casually but uncomfortably, told me several things. First, I found out that the people here in Yasumizu were a bit on edge right now. The reason for that was the fact that, excluding me, they had 3 whole outsiders here. I'd assumed this myself from what I knew so far, but apparently, yesterday morning, a little girl was found straying around the Sadanaga Rapids. They couldn't even find out her name, let alone who her parents were, so they didn't know how to handle her. For now, one of the inhabitants was looking after her. Like I'd been told, the more superstitious inhabitants, Tai-san mostly, saw her as a bad omen. I suggested leaving her to the police, but Chaimi didn't seem to think it was a good idea. It barely made sense to me, but if I were to believe her, things around here were such that not even the cops would do anything. And apparently, the remaining 2 outsiders were a pair of journalists gathering info for a magazine article. Unlike the little girl and I, they tried to come here via the normal route, through Kami Fujiyoshi, and therefore weren't considered a bad omen or whatever. Still, even normal outsiders put the people here on edge. Through this talk, I also got some details about the area itself. Yasumizu was a settlement part of an autonomous region called Fujiyoshi Village, or simply Fujiyoshi. It had also been on the map I'd seen before at the store. Fujiyoshi was split into 2 areas, Yasumizu and Kamafujiyoshi. There, they were separated by a mountain. Going to Kamafujiyoshi took about an hour by foot, or 20 minutes by car, on the winding but paved road. Side note, the school the students went to was in Kamafujiyoshi. These 2 settlements had ties so strong they shared customs and culture. Jamie said the local seasonal events were quite unconventional. I asked her to elaborate, but all she would say was that Yasumizu had special meaning to Fujiyoshi. She was making me more suspicious than I wanted to be. This conversation wasn't nearly as exciting as the one we had last night. Well, at least I found out she didn't have a boyfriend right now. Very intriguing. It was nearly noon when Takumi-san came back, ending my waiting game. Side note, the door was fully open the entire time we waited. It was probably Chaimi's way of saying that nothing bad was happening here.
バイクってのはおめえもんだな、おやっさん。
去年取ったし仕事じゃねえ。
I really didn't expect them to just carry it here. Like, sure, there were 2 of them, but just how much mass did you have to haul a 200-kilogram piece of metal so easily? The unpaved road and the river made my sweet ride really damn muddy.
どうやってあの崖を上げたんです？
滑車があんだよ。たまに下から物を引き上げなきゃなんねえから。
おい、匠。
と、余計なこと言ってる場合じゃねえ。これ大丈夫なのか？だいぶ水に浸かっちまったみてえだけど。
どうかな。見てみます。
じゃああとは任すぜ。おやっさん、結構かかっちまったから、研ぎ直しは明日まで待ってもらえっか。
I saw them off with a loud thank you. Now then.
手伝おっか？
とりあえず一人でなんとかなるかやってみるよ。
The worst part of the repairs was right at the beginning. I wanted to start by washing it, but the old lady, Tai Yamawaki was her full name, got really mad at me. She didn't want any Sadanaga mud on the ground here because it was corrupt or something. but this plaza was the only place with easy access to a water supply tap, so I did my best and convinced her to let me wash it as close to the edge as possible. Once it was clean, I could start checking on what was wrong with it. It actually looked pretty good. Bent in places, sure, but the wash got rid of the bad sound the wheels made. The only problem was that both tires were flat, and it was a pretty big one.
道具とか持ってきてないの？普通バイク旅行とかって持ってくるもんじゃないの？
いざとなればロードサービス呼べばいいかな的なノリだったんで。
不準備。
いや、返す言葉もない。正直やけくそで出発したから冷静でもなかったのかも。
お？事情を聞いてほしそう。
彼女に振られたんだよ。
なんか嘘っぽいな。
It wasn't.
それはともかく、パンク修理道具か。野里屋敷ならあるかもしれないな。
野里屋敷？
うん、安水で一番大きなお家。野里屋敷にないものは安水にはないよ。
なるほど。じゃあそこの人にお願いしに行こ
う。実はあんまり会うのはおすすめできないんだけど、背に腹は変えられないか。
また偉い人が登場？
その上ちょっと人格的にね。
Alright, and why don't we stop it there? This is audapostrophe, and you've been watching Raging Loop, running on PlayStation 5. Again, this is a PlayStation 4 title. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching. I will see you at the next stream.